Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar. Please be reminded that all microphones are muted throughout the meeting. And for comments, please use the chat box. And for questions, please use the questions box. Our speaker for tonight is Ms. Kate Wilson, CEO of the Digital Impact Alliance. She has over 26 years of experience in bringing diverse stakeholders together to find common ground in business, technology, and policy, holding leadership roles in both the corporate and nonprofit sector. Prior to joining Dial, Ms. Kate was part of PATH, where she designed and led several global projects working in both Africa and Asia, most notably those including the use of digital technology to improve the delivery of immunization services and health information systems for universal health coverage. Ms. Kate also held diverse senior roles in the commercial software sector and international trade. Also joining us tonight are Mr. Wamik Noor and Ms. Brittany Kaplan of Dial. May we now call on our speaker, Ms. Kate. Hello, Ms. Kate. Can you unmute your microphone, please?
Hi. Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Kate Wilson. Thank you, Cha, very much for the delightful introduction. I'm excited to be here with you all today. It's been a few years since I was working with AeHIN, most notably in one of our prior productions of a similar ebook, which we're presenting today, on health information systems for better health. Like that ebook, we really built beyond scale the program that I'll be going through today to really tailor to the needs of specific NGO implementers as well as country information leaders such as yourselves in health informatics as well as agriculture and others. I was hopeful before we got started, we might be able to just have a brief round of sort of introductions. I note that we have about 15 people. I know that it might take a little while for everyone to unmute themselves, but maybe if you can just type in briefly in the chat box any common questions that you have or any basic introductions about yourself and your name. If we can just take a moment to do that. Okay. So thank you very much. I know that we have a number of attendees, as Shah had noted for me, from academia, from a number of countries, I think 10 countries across Asia. I have had the pleasure of being in a number of the Asia eHealth Informatics Network meetings in the past and presented to you, so I'm excited to sort of a lively discussion. We've structured today so that there are questions that are interspersed throughout. So please, as you have questions on specific slides, we'll take a couple of moments to pause. And if you could just post those in the chat window, I'd be very appreciative. And Cha, if you can help me in terms of some of the others. Wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we did in developing this ebook. But before I do that, I wanted to take just a moment to talk about the Digital Impact Alliance, why we were formed, and how we are structured. So the Digital Impact Alliance was formed just over 2 years ago, and I became its CEO at that point in time. It was formed by a number of donor agencies who realized that many of the barriers that were affecting digital development had been created from fragmented funding that had gone forward. And they wanted to create a neutral organization that could be focused on ensuring that global development efforts would reach the underserved and those who needed it most. And they asked us to take as a mission to sort of help connect efforts from donors, industry, governments, and NGOs to help create a more inclusive digital society. We do this and contribute our efforts by contributing expertise in technology solutions for international development, helping focus on business and financing models that will help ensure scale. And most critically, and some of the subject of what we'll talk about today, is looking at really a lot of the operational research, the how-to that are collected from those in the sector, helping document and be able to describe those and being able to disseminate those to practitioners who could use them to actually develop out their own robust programs. When we started on this operational research of Beyond Scale, what we were really focused on were a few challenges in the field. One of the things that I'd noted over my years at PATH was that we were spending a lot of time, as were others, on developing many programs that talked about how you were going to incorporate digital technology at the beginning of the life cycle. So how would you think about planning a new program and using technology? How do you select which solutions to use? How do you think about setting up your team? Those are all incredibly important, and the sector has done a great job over the last decade, basically, of developing guidance and kind of learning from a lot of fits and starts. And we have had a number of efforts that were running, well, many of them never reached pilot. A number of you were already running large-scale programs that have been running for a number of years that have been deployed within the sector, such as health, where I worked for many years. What we saw, though, is we took a step back and we started to dial and began to devise the Beyond Scale program, was we started looking at it and we said, you know, what there isn't a lot of is there's not a lot of information that helps you think about, once you have a program at scale, how do you make it sustainable? How do you have it leave one state and go to 10? How do you think about leaving one province and going to multiple places? How do you think about the issues that might happen if you decide to take one piece of technology and put it in multiple other programs or countries? So when we just thought about designing Beyond Scale, we were looking really at making this very distinct from many of the ebooks that have come before by doing a couple of practical things. One, we were really focused on this sort of 4 to 5 year mark of a program. Often when it's been running for some period of time, questions of its business model become more pertinent than ever. The technology may be slightly aging and you have to think about how you might revamp the program or make it scale to address more customers. We were also looking at how we could think about some of the challenges and how you were going to roll over staff. And so we were focused really precisely on this time period where there's an inflection point where you're large, but you still need to go a bit further. As we did this, we didn't want to do it sitting from a place of the global north, where we thought, you know, we have all the answers or we have this, but instead we were using a joint learning approach where we were pulling the best of examples that exist around the world. So what we really focused on was how we were going to both find meaty case studies of large-scale programs that were already running at this type of scale and had dealt with many of these questions before. We also wanted to talk to the best in class of multiple sectors across multiple continents and be able to determine which ones could offer new resources. We also looked to academia and to the private sector where we could pull in examples that would help us find different resources. And we've embedded in the book essentially a set of resources and tools and training tips that would be able to offer to others, you know, what were the best of what your colleagues were learning as they took this journey. How is the book divided? So what we did is we sat and we worked with practitioners around the world over the course of a year was to essentially try and frame it from the customer viewpoint. We looked at common roles that took place within programs or projects, and we thought about what were the needs that these people have as they are trying to scale their program and make it more sustainable in more geographies or in a new context. And what we designed then were 7 chapters or modules that should help answer and address very key specific questions around strategy, the business model, the legal and policy and regulatory framework and how those things were going to change, what were new solutions that could be designed that would, and how your technology solution would have to change, how you spend time rolling it out. Because if you're designing and developing a new solution that's built on your old one or having to redesign it, you now have a whole set of rollout questions that may be quite different than when you were scaling something to 10 or even 10,000 people, because now you're looking at orders of magnitude of millions. And we started to really address and dig into what were the human capacity challenges and partner relationships that may be needed. Because we found that many of the things that had gotten you to this point in time where you were successful to have scaled now needed to be changed and reassessed. And so what we did was we grounded it in the case study of both Soko, a large agricultural program that was run in Africa and scaled to multiple countries, which is a private sector company. They've had multiple inflection shifts, multiple CEO changes to look at how they actually scaled their program and revisited their business model along the way, as well as the effort of BBC Media Action large-scale health program, which is scaled to multiple states in India. And drawing from their experiences, we looked at what were the challenges that they were facing and how we were going to move forward beyond that and what they would advise. So before I dive into the chapters, I wanted to take just a moment to pause and see if there were any specific questions that people had.
Thank you, Ms. Kate. For those who have questions in the first part, please type your questions in the questions box. If you cannot find the questions box, you may type your questions in the chat box. Thank you.
I think there's one, but I can't quite read it, Ja.
I think they typed in their names. Okay.
Okay, it's just his name, yes. Okay. No questions? Okay, we'll move on. So I wanted to dig in just to what some of the modules look like. So as I mentioned, there are 7 modules, and one of the first ones is strategy. And this is really focused on how do you see changes that are taking place in your program as you move forward? How do you think about enabling financial sustainability, and how does that overall focus take place? There's a couple of reasons that the strategy tends to happen. There's often a transition at this point in time of a digital program's ownership. In many countries, particularly in Africa, you may see transition from a donor government led project over to a government. You may see the end of an initial funding cycle that has taken place, or an expansion of new services or geographies, such as a Soko fix. We've also often seen changes in regulatory environments or competitive landscapes that have affected this. There's always a number of reasons that have changed basically your program somewhere in this time period. You know, we live in a time of eternal change. What we were trying to do was help capture what were some of the strategies that these programs found were particularly useful to them as they developed it. And then we thought that one of the pieces that could help was to ground this not in sort of overall platitudes of what were happening, but really to try and break it down into very specific steps. And each of the chapters is designed with these sets of steps, such as I've illustrated here. In strategy, that's about looking at the health of your digital program. So how is it embedded within the overall context of the program? Is it still as key for, say, a health implementation as it was at the beginning, or is it even larger than that? It's helping you look at what are the specific strategic questions that often come about, and we've pulled those working with implementers around the world. And then we thought about how we look at identifying risks and sort of preparing for changes, and what are some specific steps and strategies, and then deliberately provide some tools to help you think about revising strategic plans for each aspect of your work. So as I mentioned, it's broken down, and this page illustrates the layout. This is for this chapter of strategy, but to be clear, this is actually the layout and what you will see in every chapter in the ebook, which is roughly 245 pages. I promise we are not walking through all 245 pages of this, But what we wanted to take time to do today was actually to illustrate to you what were the resources that you could find in this and give you an introduction to each of these, and then help devise where we can find some specific strategies or things, so you'd get a chance to look at it a bit more at your leisure. So how these chapters are divided is, on the left, we provide here the specific steps that are that illustrate what you would need to think about as you revisited your strategy. And then we've broken down each of the chapter modules into these specific steps. And then on the left-hand side of each page, you'll see the specific detail of the step. Whereas on the right-hand side of the page, what you'll see is very specific and practical examples that have been drawn from the field. In this case, it's an example of how it was done in mHealth in Kenya with embedded videos. We also have pulled other examples and resources that we found from our over 400 interviews and embedded them here, and provided down at the bottom, here where you see this how-to box, some very specific templates that one can use to actually be able to pull that out. So then moving forward in each chapter, what we've done is we've broken it into specific components. So you'll see in this chapter of strategy, we have how do you actually do a landscape analysis. We've broken it into very specific frameworks that you can use to think about as you develop your strategy. What is a replication strategy? Just doing exactly the same thing that you've done before. How does that differ from one where you're diversifying and where you may be fundamentally changing overall your strategy? We've provided a very specific glossary for each chapter that sort of helps you, takes you through a guide of terminology that you may not be super familiar with. I found that often health implementers were not necessarily as comfortable with business terminology, as an example. So we would take time to basically spend time to sort of define what each of those were and how you might think about using it. Then moving here, we would also look at how we would evaluate kind of human resource needs, as well as providing a summary of chapter resources, and again, very specific links to each of the individual programs that we have. From the chapter components, what we did was then provide, as I mentioned, video and audio guidance, as well as specific stories that one could find, and very specific online resources. As I mentioned, we did not just pull from work that we had done ourselves or that practitioners had done in digital development. We looked at sort of best in breed of how one could do very simple terminology-based things, such as doing a SWOT analysis or how to evaluate corporate strategy, pulling from academia, from multiple programs. I then wanted to say that one of the things that I've always found very effective, and I've seen be very useful in different ebooks, is actually pulling from specific videos. So I apologize. And this is an example of some of that video programming that is embedded throughout this ebook. All of these are hosted on Vimeo. So this is Kathy Mwangi of mHealth Kenya and their story.
Miss Kate, can you try increasing the volume, please?
Increasing the volume, sure.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm not sure if everyone was able to hear all of Kathy based on the child's comments, but essentially, sorry, hold on. That was great. So sorry about that. The video decided to continue after that. So what I wanted to sort of take a moment just to pause on was sort of Kathy's comments around learning new skills as we all change our work, and how what the ebook tries to do is it assumes that no one is an expert in everything, but it tries to provide some very specific and practical examples for how you can learn the things that maybe you don't know quite so well. And so by pulling from a number of the different experts around the world, what we've tried to capture is sort of their voices and their lessons about how they figured it out, and then try to provide some very specific examples to kind of link groups together across the world. So one of the things that it also does is it provides sort of their pro tips. So these are the very specific ones for strategy, but within each chapter, we have an embedded set of kind of pro tips of how they've done some of the work that they've tried and some of their key lessons, the things that they wish they had known as they were trying to do this. And so in the case of strategy, what they all really emphasized was that, you know, if you leave stakeholders out, you aren't really going to be able to provide a comprehensive view that brings everyone along with you as you develop out your next 4 to 5 years. They also really emphasize the degree to which one had to set very specific measurable milestones and metrics that could guide everyone as they developed out the next 4 or 5 year plan, and to really spend a lot of time on the organizational behavior and change management practices that one would need to put in place in order to bring people forward on with strategy. That really, if you set those components correctly, and if you did that, then the next 7 modules would really flow from that. So what I wanted to do was actually give you a preview of some of the topics that are covered in some of the next pieces. So as I mentioned, chapter 1 was on strategy, and chapter 2 really dives into business model. So it has all the same elements of what we've just discussed. It has audio tips, it has pro tips, it has resources, it has glossaries, but it really dives into very specifically the questions about how your funding or business model may need to change. Where this happened for both Ahsoka and for BBC Media Action was they radically rethought their business model and had learned quite a bit from their existing customers about how they needed to change them. And so what they did was they offered very specific case studies about how they redesigned it. And what we tried to do was extrapolate out from that, what were some of the key things that they needed to think about, what were key things that everybody needed to think about, of looking at how does changing landscape affect the digital solution? How does it really affect your total cost of ownership? And we've offered examples from the health field as an example about how to use some digital cost, how to actually do total cost of ownership for your digital solution. It then also helps dive into kind of looking at what are sources of revenue and who might pay for the next phase of your digital program, and then be able to forecast revenue for the digital program and provide templates for that. And then it helps you with determining time to get to financial sustainability and when you can develop a case for secure investment. And so how would you then take an investment plan to either the government, in many of your cases, to basically sustain your digital investment, and how to actually do that? None of this are things that people haven't tried already in the community. We have many of these tools together. What the ebook really tries to emphasize is how do you bring all of these together? How do you make them work? And what are the steps in the process that one would need to take? And then where do you automatically go to get some very specific tools and templates? It's simply a guide to help you find some of those resources that may exist, so you don't have to constantly search and think, what do I need to go do next? It's not to say that they're the only tools that exist. In fact, we would love for people to contribute other tools that may exist that you may be using, but this should provide you with a little bit of sort of a step-by-step of how others have tried it. We also dig into legal policy and regulatory issues that come up. In my experience, we often forget to think a lot about how user privacy, consumer protection, IP protection around the digital solution that you have may be changing at this 4 to 5 year mark. It really helps you with assessing the impact of what laws and policy changes. Many AeHIN members, I know I worked with you in this context, are dealing with sort of changing regulations that may be coming about from universal health coverage changes. You may have new consumer privacy laws that are coming onto the books around protection of citizen privacy. This will help you assess some of the impact of evolving laws and help you think about some of the pieces that you may take into account as you design the solution. It also really starts to dig into, you're using existing software and hardware, oftentimes open source, but you may be transitioning it to another type of commercial level platform. How do you think about digging into the SLAs that are provided from your compatriots? How do you think, or from your vendors? How do you think about dealing with some of the intellectual property ownership issues that may come about from open source once it's changed and morphed and you're contributing back source code? So we help dive into some of those issues in legal and policy. Following, we then talk about what's the solution design. A big issue that we've seen often along the way, and that many of the people that we worked with dealt with, was really focusing on how do they have big changes in the solution as it reaches that 4 to 5 year mark. Sometimes that comes about from scale. You find that the current solution you have can no longer deal with the larger reality of what you're tackling. Sometimes it comes about because you're changing countries, and now you have to think about how are we going to, or oftentimes in many countries, particularly in Asia, where you're seeing changing needs around what languages must be supported. How do we start thinking about localization? How do we think about, either building on top of what we have or starting all over from scratch? So what we really try to do is take a step back and say, looking at a human-centered design approach, what were the requirements and how were those requirements changing from the original viewpoint of where you were setting it up. You probably did much of this at the beginning of the program, of thinking of who was your customer and how was it designed. What we try and help provide some tools and guidance is how would you think about and what were some of the questions you'd want to tackle now? And thinking about how the external factors are starting to change some of the solutions that you have. We then also dive into, some tips and tricks for how to prioritize new features and set targets, as well as helping think about how you might work differently with developers that you have dealt with. And then one which we've seen trip up a number of programs, and almost everyone said spend more time on, was actually how you were going to deploy, migrate, and maintain the solution that you already have in place. Our next chapter takes, if you look at this, you can see that we're moving quickly from a cycle of here is, the strategy that you have, here's how you think about your changing business needs, here's how you're thinking about your changing solution needs. Now, how are you going to roll that out? In beginning, you were probably rolling out to, a couple thousand users or maybe 10,000 users to test. And you've been slowly over time scaling that to larger and larger audiences. What we try and tackle is how are you going to scale that to a much larger group of people when you're going from 10,000 to 10 million in a day? And how do you keep one solution running and run it in parallel while you're deploying the next set? And what are the things you need to think about in terms of how you're tackling, the project management for that type of scale? How many more people do you need? How do you think about the sustainable technical support? Are you going to set up your own help desks, or are you working with perhaps an M&O to actually provide that help desk support for you? And then thinking about how you're going to set up new distribution channels, potentially, if you are no longer the ones who are actually directly pushing the solution out. So after that, and thinking through some of those challenges, then what we dive into is the human capacity challenges that come about with this. What many programs experience, although not all, is that somewhere around this 3 to 4 year mark, when sort of the excitement of building the new solution and standing up a new program, you often see large scale changes in the people who are supporting it. You also have a need for different types of technical talent than perhaps you needed at the beginning of the program. So what this module helps you do is help assess what's some of the human capacity that you may need, and then how some of your colleagues tackled this, and then considering hiring different staff or building out larger contracting relationships. So it helps you look at sort of your human resources strategy, building out a detailed staffing plan and showing you what some of their staffing plans look like, how you bring the right people on board at different points in time. And much as Kathy was sort of starting to illustrate in her video, if you could hear it, was how do you start thinking about the different ways that you might build skills or train and have cascade training of different programs. And then finally, and most importantly, how do you set sort of a culture for your overall organization where you can express, model, and sort of reinforce what these behaviors are and help build that at a much larger scale? This is quite different when you're doing it for an organization of hundreds than when you were doing it for an organization of 5 or 10. And learning from your colleagues, you can see things, tips and tricks, which they found that were quite useful at that point in time. And then moving on, as I mentioned, sometimes programs choose to build that human capacity and develop it. Often you look at different types of vendor relationships that you may strike. And so it helps you both assess the existing digital programs that you have, but then identify, are there new partners that you need along the way? How do you update their agreements and revise governance structures to break some of the new cycles, but scale and build more scalable partners across? And then how do you transfer knowledge to your partners and build out some of the components that make a successful program, and then manage them successfully throughout this? So I've given you quite a bit of content about the 7 modules that are included in this, but we feel that each of these is pretty critical to sort of helping scale programs that have taken place, in multiple continents and across multiple sectors. very much in the spirit of which AeHIN was founded, that we all have more to learn from one another, and we all have something to learn and something to teach. I wanted to take some time to kind of answer questions about the brief overview that we've given you of what's contained within this ebook, and also invite my colleagues who worked on the book to also help answer any questions that you may have about the content that is contained within the ebook, or other examples. As I mentioned, this is quite a robust ebook. It's roughly 240 pages filled with resources and other things. We have both a PDF version as well as an interactive ebook that you can access to access all this content. And we think, besides being useful to members of AeHIN, we hope that you might also share it with your government, private sector, or other colleagues as you exist. So I'm going to stop now. I'm always excited to hear sort of a rich discussion, and hope that you'll ask any questions that you may have about the ebook.
Thank you for that, Miss Kate. I received a message from Dr. Sibui. He says, please cover the role of government, because in South Africa, most of the implementation is still done by NGOs, making sustainability difficult whenever there should be some handover.
Yes, so thank you for the question, Dr. Savoy. So this book is actually designed, and in fact, one of the reasons that we looked at BBC Media Action as an example is that they're going through exactly that transition case. So we recognize that in oftentimes in middle-income countries and many AeHIN members, it's a government-led program, and so you've designed it and set it up from scratch. But in many parts of Africa and still some parts of Asia, it has been a donor-funded, NGO-led project that the government's now interested in taking over and would like to take, to the next level and embed it across all of its programming, but they have not yet done that. This ebook is designed from the in large part from the experience of BBC Media Action of doing exactly that. They actually are handing over a program that they helped incubate, 3 individual programs that they helped incubate to multiple states across India. So what they were looking at was what were the experiences that they learned. So in Sarah Chamberlain's case, who was the head of BBC Media Action, she helped found the program from scratch, and now she's handing the entire program over to the government. But the challenges that she's facing as she hands that to the government are radically different than what she had when she was just first trying to design and test what would work with 10,000 people. So what they're really looking at is how they might evolve this and use this. So this ebook is written to help address the questions that she had at that 4 or 5 year mark. So what were the things that you were tackling sort of at the 4 or 5 year mark that are radically different than when you first designed the program? So this should actually help quite a bit with programs in Africa that are doing the same.
Thank you for that, Ms. Kate. We also acknowledge the presence of our AeHIN members inside the room. We have Dr. Bonchai, Dr. Alvin, and Dr. Fazila. Dr. Alvin would like to say that we are very interested in applying this in AeHIN and in Africa. Also, Dr. Bonchai would like to speak.
Wonderful. Hello, Dr. Bonchai.
Hello, Kate. Thank you very much. It's very interesting things. My question to you is that even this you talking about beyond scale. So to me it seems like we move from one project to another projects, and all the 7 modules it seems very comprehensive and very useful. My question is that how this is different from the tools or the methodology of the program management. Any difference, or I mean, the big difference between the methodology of the program management. Over. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you very much for the question, Dr. Boonchai. So what I would say is where the two distinct differences, and I'm going to answer your question, but then expand on something that I said at the beginning. So what makes this book unique is a couple of things. So one is that it starts from the basis of you are already running a program successfully. You have already dealt with a lot of these questions, and there are many excellent tools that already exist by sector that helped you design your program. What we found was, though, that when we were designing this book, is that there's very little that helps you once you've been running it for a while and you then have to take the next evolutionary cycle to build it to a much broader number of users than you've had in the past. You've already scaled, but you need to now make this sustainable. And so program management is a critical part of this, and it does have many of the aspects of it, but it's a bit broader in the sense that it's broader and more focused in the sense that it's taking you at a specific moment in time. So you've already done this, you've done it at some scale. Now you have to address a whole new set of questions. The discipline of the different modules isn't radically different than what you would find in most program management sort of textbooks. I mean, I come out of, sort of business planning and business modules. We've structured it in a way that deliberately pulls on those different tools, but the sets of questions that you're answering now are quite different. And what we tried to do was pull in, I've given you the highlights, and the highlights are, relatively, common across many things. But what we've tried to do within the ebook itself is embed specific examples of how colleagues have tried to tackle it at those moments in time in the context of health or agriculture. The other thing we were really trying to illustrate, and what I hope makes this unique, is that, though we would love to hear feedback from you all, is that we're actually trying to span across sectors. Oftentimes, when I came out of the context of health, we would treat information systems as if they were unique and the problems were unique to, health or unique to our country. When in reality, many of the things that people are struggling with are actually quite common, both by sector, and the technology changes that you have are a construct of the environment in which you're in. And so we really tried to illustrate where there were common things that one could learn and where there were tools or resources that others had developed in sectors that you may have never seen before. I know that coming out of health, I often did not see anything that was, a great framework or a toolkit or guidance that came from someone in financial services. But it really answered the same types of questions that I had in health. And so we're trying deliberately to begin building some crossover between those specific sectors. That is part of Dial's mission, so that we can build on that. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, how are you, Dr. Fasila?
I'm doing great, and this book is just great, and I just love it. And yeah, so you were mentioning the pro tips for your digital program where you had these 3 orange boxes.
Yes.
Involve all stakeholders, change management, and so forth. Based on all our experience, we usually underestimate change management. As you know, in health sector, it's very important to have a buy-in of all stakeholders. So I think that's very important point there in any digital investment. But most of the project that we are doing is we do pilots, but when we want to do scale up, we have a lot of challenges. And I think this book will be a great guide on what are the areas to focus to ensure the scale up will be successful and sustainable. So thank you so much for doing this book.
Oh, that makes me so happy, Dr. Fazila.
Yeah. And one more thing also I think is very important. As many countries move towards public-private partnership kind of projects, it's usually long-term. And for a long-term project, it's usually broken. Like some of the projects I'm doing right now, it's usually we'll try a pilot. If it's successful, then we will scale up for a public-private partnership. It's usually between 20 to 27 years, a kind of partnership. So I think this is very important upfront to understand what is required for scaling up, like human resource requirement, financial sustainability, and so forth. So I'm just so excited to see this book, because this is what we are doing right now, and I think we can also learn, use this book as a guide to move forward. So that's my comment on the book.
Terima kasih banyak.
Sama-sama.
One thing which would be very helpful is if you or anyone else on the line does choose to use this, what we have, part of the way we've developed this and with our colleagues is thinking about this as sort of a living resource. We are also the principals for digital development stewards. So we're constantly looking for new examples to help connect people with others. So if you do end up using this, we would love to find out, more about your experiences, what things you would change, how you would add to it, both to inform sort of evolutions of this book, but also to help contribute to the principles for digital development and the research there.
Yeah, definitely. I will.
And then if I might, are there other questions that people have?
There are none so far, Ms. Kate.
Why don't we'll pause just a minute just to see.
If you cannot find it, we also have the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. What I would also offer for those of you who are on the line, we will be, or for colleagues, and we'll send out if we can with you, Cha. In February, we will actually be working with the Department of Foreign Industry and Trade in Foreign Assistance and Trade from Australia to actually host an event in Jakarta that will both feature some updated work that we've done on the principles for digital development, sort of toolkits about how to actually implement and use the principles within the context of your work. And we'll also be featuring some of the work here. So we would, love to invite you or many of your colleagues to join us there in Jakarta. We will also be doing a similar event in Delhi during that same time in cooperation with BBC Media Action. So we can send out details after this if AeHIN members are interested, and we would love to invite you to join us at either of those two events to learn more.
Thank you, Ms. Kate. Please keep us posted.
Okay.
I think there are no more questions, so we can
Okay.
wrap up the session.
Okay.
Are there any last words from Dr. Bunsai and Dr. Fazila?
I am planning to use this very soon, this book, because we are already doing a project right now, Kate,
Fantastic.
where it is a 2 years of pilot and 20 years of scale up. So but the contract will be 2 different contracts. So we will try to, we are also trying to put in some of the requirements of the phase 2 in phase 1. So maybe with that experience, we can also further improve or have more other experiences in this book. So I will get back to you once I've done that.
That's fantastic. I will send you a follow-up email as well.
Please. Yes, please.
that sort of ties in and connect you with many of my colleagues that are here.
Yeah, sure.
I also wanted to just take one moment to ask, I think, one question as well, and then highlight one thing also that the Digital Impact Alliance is working on right now, which we would love to get input on from many of you. One of you noted in the business module, we had something on the total cost of ownership and how one could sort of calculate some of the total cost of ownership. We think that there are some interesting tools that are out there right now, but we've seen that there's a bit of a gap in sort of understanding and ability sometimes to sort of construct strong financial models that deal with technology implementations and how you would look at both the revenue as well as the cost side. So the DIAL is actually undertaking some work to build sort of a generic model that countries might be able to use. I know also that you all have done some work. We had a wonderful call a few weeks ago with Dr. Alvin and UNICEF on how you were looking at doing this for health, but would mention and would like to sort of tie together those efforts very deliberately and also learn, some of the needs from people who are on this call. So if you are interested in helping, comment upon that and help provide us with some of your, needs, we would love to get some input as we're designing that now. So I would want to offer that out. The second thing I wanted to just ask was, are there specific events besides the ones that we've highlighted where you think that this might be, we're presenting sort of beyond scale, or some of our other programming in the Principles for Digital Development or financial modeling might be useful in the future?
Okay, thank you, Kate. It's always excellent. I remember the interoperabilities, the ebooks that you have done, and it's superb. This one, I think, is very useful. We gonna have the AeHIN GM on October, so I think this kind of tools, dial could be, one of the feature that you can share with our member in the conference and GM. And again, thank you that give us the new tools and the new the knowledge that we can deal with our challenge. And I think Dr. Fasila will be can contribute to the improvement, or the get more information to get this kind of this development forward. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to helping this, and we really hope that you'll look to us as sort of a resource to help tailor some of these things, because it's really about capturing your knowledge. Our job is to help document it and put it out. Your job, but you have the hard job, which is actually doing it in the first place. So thank you all so much for the time this evening. Your time. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone. If you have questions on this book, please feel free to contact us so we can connect you to the DIAL community. Thank you, Ms. Kate.
Thank you, Cha.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay.